நிஜமான கதைகளு சுவையோடு சுகமாக உருவான கதைகளு.
Chapter 3. Important Events in the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement, as discussed in this book, happened in the 1950s and 1960s. This chapter covers some of the major events that propelled the movement forward to culminate in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Executive Order 9981. The US President Harry S. Truman issued the Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948. This order abolished racial segregation in the US Army. African Americans have always played a significant role in the US Army, starting from the initial skirmishes that triggered a full-blown civil war. Prince Estabrook was the first African American who died in the Battle of Concord. Hundreds and thousands of African Americans fought in the US armed forces alongside their white brothers through all the wars. Yet, the level of racial integration in the armed forces of the country did not really happen until 1950, even after President Truman passed the Executive Order 9981. The road of the racial integration in the armed forces began in 1941 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed and passed the Executive Order 8802, and yet the armed forces skewed towards racial segregation through World War II. Civil rights activists and organizations like A. Philip Rudolph, NAACP, and the National Urban League urged President Truman to extend racial integral to civilian staff in the Department of Defense as well. After a lot of negotiations, protests, and rallies, Truman passed the Executive Order 9981 in 1948. Initially, the response was mixed, although the US Navy, which was always more skewed towards integration than segregation, happily accepted the order. The US Army opposed the change initially, but the loss of life from the Korean War drove the US Army to end segregation and accept all people willing to join. The integration in the US Defense Forces cleared obstacles in the path of the Civil Rights Act. On July 26, 1963, Robert S. McNamara, President Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, banned all kinds of racial discrimination within facilities used by US soldiers in and around all military bases. Brown versus the Board of Education. This court case involved the segregation of white and black children in the schools and field of education. Before lawyers, led by Thurgood Marshall, fought and won this case, African Americans were not allowed to go to schools that were meant only for white children. Before the Brown versus Board of Education case, the US courts decreed in 1896 that it was legal to have separate schools and public utilities for blacks and whites. Throughout the southern states of the United States, all public places, including parks, schools, movie theaters, hotels and restaurants, and even drinking water fountains were separate for the whites and the African Americans. Moreover, it was illegal for an African American to use facilities reserved for the white people. One of the biggest groups that worked hard to remove such racial discriminations was the NAACP. They gave legal support to all African American children who applied for admission to all white schools and were not admitted for being black. The law in those days said schools could be separate provided they were equal in all other aspects, including quality of teachers, infrastructure, labs, etc. However, the NAACP lawyers argued the schools were not equal. These lawyers took out 5 cases from among the many they were arguing and combined them into one case and brought it before the Supreme Court as Brown versus the Board of Education. This case resulted in a landmark judgment in 1954 when the Supreme Court held that segregation in public schools was illegal. This legal case and the outcomes spurred the civil rights movement significantly. The impact of this legal case was that the idea of integration and the banning of segregation spread like wildfire, even though the ruling applied only to public schools. Throughout the civil rights movement of the 1950s, 1960s, black people participated in sit-ins, rallies, and other forms of non-violent protest to take away segregation from all public places and not just in schools.